I feel like I'm supposed to do the American introduction now, just so that I can introduce you to the people at home. Here, it goes like this.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Wil Anderson, star of... Right. Charlie is your sidekick extraordinaire, right? I mean, not literally in the real world, but as far as the podcasting goes, the two of you have been side by side. What was the first podcast? Let's start there.
Yeah, okay. So he's my partner. He's not my sidekick. He is my
You're
podcasting
his as well.
partner.
You're his as well.
Exactly. Yeah, we are each other's sidekick, which is actually probably a pretty good description of the relationship that we have. We were podcast lovers. We love Kevin Smith's podcast, Smodcast, that he did with his producer Scott Mosier. And Charlie's an actor. He's not a comedian, but our slogan, the thing that we introduce our episodes of TOFOP with, which is everyone relax, which is the first words he said on stage when he tried stand-up comedy once. The idea that he needed everyone to relax at the start, we found incredibly amusing and became part of the furniture of our show. And so Charlie and I would just talk about this podcast that we liked, but then we realised the reason we liked it was if we were at a party together, we'd eventually find each other in the corner having these ridiculous conversations speculating about pop culture or talking about football or, but not talking about football in a way that our friends talked about football, talking about football in the same way as we talked about Batman or in the same way as we talked about The Rock or in the same way as we basically talked about anything. It wasn't really what we were talking about that was the important bit. It was how we were talking about it, the relationship between the two of us and how we just had conversations together. And so we thought, let's start the show. And we started a show. So initially our show was called, and again, this is the show of somebody who did not know that podcasting was going to be a thing, because we've said it many times. We would have given people the name of the show that was easier to understand, and we didn't have to explain every single time if we knew that we were going to explain it still in a decade from now. But this was like over 10 years ago. And so podcasting was a thing, but it wasn't really a big thing at that stage. So we really didn't go in with a plan at all. And we were trying to come up with a name that just had a bit of fun to it, that described the idea of what the show would be. And so it was back in the days where your show didn't have to be about anything, and our show has never become about anything. And the idea of putting pod in the title seemed appealing. So the initial name of the podcast is 30 Odd Foot of Pod, which is abbreviation TOFOP. Well, it is what the show is called now and has been called for the majority of the time we've actually been doing it. We changed the name very early on to the abbreviation, but it's all based on the most obscure in-joke of all time, because I'm obsessed with Russel Crowe. Now, over the 10 years that we've done our show, that obsession has taken many forms. At the start, I was quite amused by him. It was in that period where he was throwing phones at people and he was touring with his band. And anyway, so it turned out in New Zealand, before he came to Australia, Russel Crowe was a rock star. He was a rock star under the name Russ LaRock with a Q. And he released songs over there. And so he was actually a singer before he was an actor. And then he became this Oscar-winning actor. He, was throwing phones at people. He's living in Australia. He's just this big pop culture icon in our lives. And I'm already fascinated by him because I think he's an amazing actor, but at that time, probably not the best person in the world. And I'm obsessed with all of it. But more than anything, I'm obsessed with his musical career. And the fact that he had this band in Australia, well, it was an international band called 30 Odd Foot of Grunts. And then 30 Odd Foot of Grunts, which already is just one of the worst band names of all time. So I'm already 100% in. If you can't have a good band name, then at least go for just having Hootie and the Blowfish or, just some terrible, terrible band name. So 30 Odd Foot of Grunts. But the bit that got me, this is where I really got obsessed with it, was at one stage, Russel Crowe decides that his band is no longer called 30 Odd Foot of Grunts. And I don't know if he replaced musicians or he just changed the name, but he changed it to The Ordinary Fear of God. So then it was Russel Crowe and The Ordinary Fear of God, which I think you'll have noticed by now is also the initials TOFOG.
Yes.
So he kept the initials TOFOG. He was like, no, we can't get rid of TOFOG.
We've just had the T-shirts made. We've just had them made. We can't deal with it.
But we're not 30-odd footer grunts anymore. We're the ordinary fear of God. Anyway, so our entire name of our show and now our business and our website and really our indie media company that we have, with our range of shows, is all named after this absolutely obscure joke that no one really gets or remembers. But it is probably that story in of itself and how difficult it is to understand, and that really is a bit of a map for what our business plan with growing what we've done has been. It's always been about it being fun first. Like, we don't have some grand ambition to take over the world, but we have this little corner of the internet where we make, a whole bunch of shows that are unlike shows that other people are making, and they exist in our own little world, and some people seem to really enjoy them, and there is a scope within that. So now we have a whole bunch of shows. So we had TOFOP. We've had that consistently, almost consistently for the last, 10 and a half, 11 years. But Charlie had to leave the show. So Charlie is an actor, and he was cast on an Australian show called Home and Away, which I'm sure people will be familiar with in a lot of places. And if you're not, it's a daily soap opera in Australia, and a very popular daily family soap opera in Australia. And stars a lot of young, hot people, and then like some, not so young, hot people that they pretend are older, daggy people. And Charlie was cast in one of those roles. And because Charlie is exceptionally good looking to be a podcaster, it is probably the thing that has held us back in the podcasting world, is that he really, he has the opposite of a face for radio. He really does have a face for television and, a gym body for television, not to be wasted on podcasting. But down at Home and Away, the family entertainment, they did not think our riffs about, the show, particularly early on, we have a bit of a motto now we say to new listeners. We say, with TOFOP, don't start at the start. Start at the new episodes and go backwards, and then stop listening when you start to feel uncomfortable with the conversations. Because at that stage, podcasting was pretty dirty and late night, and we were certainly, having sort of, drunken, loose conversations about things that,
that shouldn't really be recorded, right? Those sort of conversations.
Right. The sort of conversations where we've had chats over the years about whether we should destroy all of evidence that those shows existed. But instead, we have a very simple motto: go backwards, stop listening when you feel uncomfortable.
It's solid.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to explain that. So Charlie had to leave the show, so I decided I still wanted to do a show. So I just did one where we would have guest Charlies, and we called it FOFOP. Now, the reason for that, people have read a whole bunch of reasons into what that means. For me, it was the idea of faux, like, as in the idea of like there being a faux universe. So it was within the same universe, but this was like, if you subscribe to that, Marvel or, comic book, idea of, there being a multiverse, this was a spin-off in the multiverse. A multiverse where Charlie couldn't exist to do the show. I would do it with other, stand-up comedians and mates of mine. So they were always guest Charlies, and it was only ever meant to be a fill-in thing. But that now is a show that's run for 8 years or 9 years or something like that, and I've done as many episodes of that as I've done of TOFOP, and it's developed its own mini sort of arcs within it, because Dave Anthony, for example, people might know Dave from The Dollop and Walking the Room. Dave Anthony's done 80 episodes of it or something.
Oh, wow.
So realistically, there's just 80 episodes of a podcast that Dave Anthony and I do together that just is within there. And people call that the DOFOP universe. So that's Dave's ones, but like Gareth Reynolds, has done a bunch of episodes, and my friend Justin Hamilton, who's a brilliant Australian comedian, Jen Kirkman's a regular. So there's people within that universe who I have a series of show with as well. And then I have this show, Wilosophy, which is, I guess, like a more serious, interview show about what people's life philosophy is. And, a lot of comedians, but not just comedians. We've had, the captain of the Australian cricket team and, the former Prime Minister of Australia and a whole bunch of those sort of guests as well. And then Charlie and I do an AFL football show. So if people don't know what AFL football is, that is Australian rules football. It is not rugby. It is not rugby league. It is not soccer. It is the Indigenous Australian
It's a terrifying amalgamation of all three, isn't it? Isn't that effectively what Aussie rules is?
And Charlie and I have a conversation which we describe as an AFL adjacent podcast because, as I mentioned earlier, we really talk about football in the same way as we talk about Batman or The Rock on TOFOP. We just imagine hypothetical situations and come up with ridiculous jokes, and they are our shows. And Charlie has done a show over the years called That's Awesome, which was a podcast series that he did, talking to people as well, including an incredible episode with his mother when she was about to die, and talking about her life and what she expected next. It's incredibly moving, and I highly recommend that if people want to check that out. And we're looking at doing some other shows as well, but it's all at tofop.com, which is we have a website and a home of all our stuff, and you can just go there and find it.
Amazing that when you were coming up with a name that definitely wasn't going to be a name that looked like you were thinking about podcasting, actually, TOFOP, you're the return search result. I mean, you'd have had a nightmare if Russel Crowe's band had taken off. In search
it was
terms
probably
and domain
the
names
greatest
and all that.
moment. I'm so glad you brought this up because I would have loved to, but I was already on a spiel telling you about all the shit that we were doing. Like it's very funny to explain to people that you have like a little podcasting empire because no one's making you do it. Like you really have an imaginary radio station. You're just basically telling somebody how good your imaginary world that nobody can fire you from is, and it's a weird thing to boast about. But secondly, I think the time we knew it was quite serious and people were into the show was that day when suddenly, if you typed in TOFO, the next thing you were going to get was our podcast and not Russel Crowe's band. And we were like, oh, well, this might... You know what? At the moment, we don't know where we are in the entertainment world, but we know we're above 30-odd foot of grunts or the ordinary fear of God.
Winning! The podcasts and comedy go hand in hand. I think they are obviously two worlds that collide particularly well. If I'm honest, my exposure to podcasting comedy has been American. Up until, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago when we started researching for Podboard. My pod library is full of American comedians. And as I've started looking around, we spoke, a few weeks ago now, and obviously I'm rifling through your back catalogue. And naively, I guess, I presumed it all looked like it was born over there. But you are a touring high-end stand-up comic. Is that a fair? Would you not take that description? Like you're a successful Australian stand-up comic. Is that less?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
And you've been podcasting for 10 years with your buddies, and lots of comics, and they all come on. I mean, the parallels between the American comedic podcast scene and the Australian one have become more and more apparent to me. How often do you cross over? Do you ever get an opportunity to sort of jump in over there and drag people back over to you? And obviously doing it like we're doing it now.
So I was based in LA for nearly 10 years, so on and off, because I was touring in America, doing stand-up. And so I would spend half of my year in the US touring over there, and I would spend half of my year in Australia. Like I have a television show and some other commitments here, and like doing the festivals, and so that would basically be my year. So I was really lucky at that time because that's the explosion of things like the LA Podcast Festival, which, the no longer around LA Podcast Festival, but the original one. There was some podcast documentaries that were made at the time. It was really an emerging art form, but the people who were into it felt like they were a real clique. Like, I don't think in my quarter of a century of doing stand-up comedy, hosting TV shows, like doing all these amazing things, I'm not sure that I could ever truly replicate the amazing feeling going to the first couple of years of that LA Podcast Festival, because it was like what I imagine for comic book nerds the first few years of Comic-Con were like, where you found your people. There were all these people who thought they were in this secret society because they knew about something that was heaps better than what everybody else was into, but it still felt a little secret society. You know, it hadn't crossed over to anything more than that. So everybody would do everybody's shows. I still think to a fair extent that is the attitude of the industry. I think that it's one of the things I love about this industry. Like, I owe a lot of my American audience to, you know, shows like Walking the Room, to shows like The Dollop, you know, really, you know, for me to be able to go out on the road with those guys, do big live shows in the US, and then, you know, those podcasts going up, you know, all over the world. That show's so popular that you find people saying, hey, I heard you on The Dollop and I, you know, found my way to your show. You know, people who heard me on Mark Maron's show, or then, you know, heard Mark Maron on my show and then come over, you know, from his show to something like Wilosophy, which is the sort of show that I think if you like Mark Maron's show, you know, you might find something in Wilosophy as well. They exist in a sort of connected universe. So I've always found this industry to be incredibly generous. And, you know, some of my favorite podcasting experiences have been on other people's shows. You know, I really do think that is the case. Like, I mean, I remember doing Doug Benson's show for the first time at UCB in LA, or, you know, doing, you know, Maron's show, sitting, you know, in that same seat that President Obama, you know, had sat in to, you know, talk to Mark Maron on his podcast. Like, those sort of moments for me were really iconic moments of that US experience. And so it's connected me to being able to still access, you know, to talk to those people and to, you know, be able to include them in my world, even though I'm, you know, for the moment, you know, really happy about being based in Australia, because I think that the scene in Australia, both comedically in the stand-up scene, which is my day job, and then in the podcast scene, which is just something because, you know, I've been lucky enough that Charlie and I have just been doing it for long enough that now all these younger people, these, you know, interesting people with their interesting shows, they feel a connection to what it is we did, just basically because you know, we were the guys who got there before the cool guys got there, you know. But
So
we're the people who still live in the neighborhood. You know, it's been gentrified. All the cool people have come in, but we've just held on to our apartment in Williamsburg.
You're the home and away dad that's been in it since he was a teenager. That's what's happened, and you've gone from surf dude to diner owner or something like that.
Smart enough to never leave the show.
Do you? Yeah. Do you feel that responsibility? Like, you are early doors in podcasting. Obviously, you have a successful comedy career that goes with it. Do you feel that now you've got you talked about the openness and the fact that I'm speaking to you, right? This podcast is now 4 shows old. I've never really done this before. We're many thousands of miles and several time zones apart. But we've spoken twice now. And I felt that throughout. I've been speaking to people like you all over, you know, the place who I would never have thought would have found time to put these on. But everyone seems to have a very similar attitude. That is, this is part of what we do. This is part of the community. And if you're talking to me on that sort of style, well, guess what? You're part of it too. So let's go. Is that how you feel back home with, you know, you must have emerging comedians and so on who queue up to want to be a part some way, somehow of, well, not TOFOP, but FOFOP or as a guest on Wilosophy? How do it must be constant.
Firstly, what I would say is that I think that there is a real responsibility in general in life to, you know, to pass your knowledge, you know, back down. It's the only way you repay the people who helped you on the way up. And I think, you know, that's always been my attitude to stand up. And that was just something that was also the attitude to podcasting. So it didn't feel foreign to me at all. The idea, I mean, I've done shows for people that I'm sure, like, I didn't ask them for the numbers, but I imagine ordinarily get like tens or hundreds of listens, you know, in the hope that my appearance on their show might, you know, bring some people to them if I think what they're doing is interesting. Like, that part of it is super exciting. Like, the idea that you can lend some of your audience or some of your, you know, social capital to highlighting, work that other people are doing. But I think that not just work that other people are doing, but work they're creating themselves. Because I know what it's like. They've just taken they haven't gone to a TV studio or a radio studio, or they haven't got a book deal, or they haven't had somebody else, organise a tour for them or any of these sort of things. They've probably just got together. They've got an idea in their head. They've found a couple of microphones and they've tried to turn that idea into a show. And so often they do. But even if they don't, I don't think that really matters. Like, sometimes people are like, that joke is there's too many podcasts. Oh, another podcast. What, are you going to start a podcast? Great. Do it. Like, not every band has to be Nirvana, right? But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to play the guitar.
Some of them can
and
be
if you
TOFOP.
just want to play the guitar, right? Like, some of my favorite bands are TOFOP. Some of my favorite podcasts are TOFOP. I mean, not my podcast, I don't mean that, but I mean the podcasts that I adore are the number one podcast in the world. My favorite podcast in the world has been, the entire time I'm into podcasting, is an American podcast called Oh Yeah Dude with Seth Romatelli and Jonathan Larroquette. And they've been doing that show for 16 years or before, way before, back in the day.
Before it
and
was
it's
even a
still
thing.
my favorite show. And it's nowhere near the biggest show in the world. It deserves to be, but it's nowhere near the biggest show in the world. But I dread the idea that they will ever stop doing that show. What I love about podcasting is that, in a difference to sort of radio or television and these sort of things, eventually if you're a big TV show that they're spending a whole bunch of money on and there's not enough people watching you, they stop making the show, right? The dynamics, the way the entertainment industry works is, we can't keep giving all these people this money to make the show. But in podcasting, I mean, it's one of the things Charlie and I joke about a lot. Our artist, James Fosdyke, who does all the original art for our episodes, we did an episode called Till We Die, which was just the idea that the two of us will be podcasting together until we die, because no one can stop you. That's the thing about this that we've never encountered in the world of this style of entertainment before, is that people only have to stop when they choose to stop. So that TV show can just keep going. That radio show can keep going. Those books can keep just getting written because they're being written. This show exists. It exists. If no one's listening, it can still exist. So, yeah, I find that to me is intoxicating when you think about what the future of entertainment is. I'm so bored by old school entertainment that has to appeal to the masses now, because my tastes are not the masses, the masses is not as obsessed with, the American sex cult NXIVM as I currently am. But if you are, right, if I watch a couple of documentaries on Netflix about this American cult and now I'm fascinated about it, the first thing that I do is I go to my podcast app and I type in NXIVM and I see who's doing podcasts about it. Can I find, I listen to probably 5 or 6 different series of things who'd all done individual episodes on this. There was a couple of other podcast series about this. Then suddenly I started listening to these cool debunking QAnon things that were linked to this cult thing and got into those. I can't sit around and wait for a movie or a television show to serve me in an entertainment sense in that way. But in that world of podcasting, it's there. I immediately can go and access something that I'm specifically interested in.
Are you freed from networks and so on now? Because stand-up comedy, short of specials and do you do the TV half-hour jump-on shows?
So I have. So there's a whole big complicated answer to that, but I like to pretend that the podcasts have no relationship to the rest of my world. There would be some people who would make the argument that that I can't just circle off things like that, but I've just decided that I can, and I'm sticking with it, and it's something that I've really had to. Early on there was a lot of issues around management being worried about things that you were saying or how they would reflect on networks. I host a television show on like the ABC, which is like our BBC, so it's a national broadcaster. People, own it, so they have opinions about it, and you have to kind of hold yourself to certain standards. And I always joked when like Home and Away were worried about Charlie, but I was like, hang on, I host like the biggest show on the ABC. Shouldn't someone be worried about me? They were kind of fine with me because my stand-up had always filled that role anyway.
Yeah.
There had
as the
early
controversial bit.
Yeah. They'd always had to get used to the idea that I was first and foremost a stand-up comedian. And so that was what I did. And if, I was going to do this other thing, it had to exist in the universe that my stand-up comedy existed in. And there's not really anything we say on the podcast that I wouldn't say on stage or vice versa. They both exist in I think you can have more interesting, in-depth conversations on a podcast. You can expand an idea, in a way that you can't on a stand-up stage. But like topics-wise or language-wise, I don't think that there would be, things that I would exclude from one or the other.
You talk on the show on TOFOP, not Wilosophy. One of them. You talk about getting Patreon to $5,000 a month, and that lets you produce 2 shows a week. That's what that's the
So
the current.
I'd like to do 2 Wilosophies a week. So during lockdown, because I'd always done them face to face. That was my kind of one Wilosophy rule. Because the show is a very free-form conversation. I don't have an agenda going into it. My interviewing style is very much, we start to talk. The basic premise of the show is, what is the meaning of life? Do you have a life philosophy? But we talk about just something interesting, hopefully. And I tend to just like to look the person I'm talking to in the eye and, get a guide from them, what they're finding interesting and, what their eyes light up when they're talking about, or, where's an interesting place? Can I go a little bit further? And so I was worried about being able to do that during COVID, over Zoom or something like this. Could I have that same connection with somebody? So I decided I would have on Wilosophy previous guests. I'd never, really had many return guests, but I was like, you know what? I'll do some catch-ups. How's the world changed for you? How has COVID changed everything? I already have a rapport with these people, so maybe I'll find it easier to, recreate that. And then that went well enough that I went to original episodes again. But I had loved those catch-up episodes. And so really what we're aiming for, and we're so close to it, it's tantalizing. For months we've been somewhere between 4,900 and 5,000, but we've even popped over 5,000 to immediately pop back behind 5,000.
Oh, no, that's
so
the worst.
It is the podcast it is the Patreon version of edging, basically, is what has been happening. But I would like to do, a brand new episode with a brand new guest once a week, and then a catch-up episode with a previous guest once a week. And that's our $5,000 aim on our Wilosophy Patreon.
So just from a geeky podcaster that's listening to this perspective, it's interesting to hear you say it so brashly. $5,000 a week, we can make 2 shows. Tell people what that goes to, like what's required to put out Wilosophy, and obviously it's not just you. What goes into it that means it needs to make money.
Yeah, so I mean there is it kind of there is a lot of cost to it to do it properly. Like TOFOP in some ways has a lot less overheads. It's Charlie and I catching up and we turn on the microphones. But what we do instead is we get James Fosdyke, who's this incredible artist. You can see all his art at tofop.com. But he does individual episode art for every single, episode that we do. And it's always just these incredible, things that he does for us. So we pay him properly to do that. We have a producer who is a incredible young man called, we call Podcast Mike, because he comes from the radio world, works with Hamish and Andy, and they called him Radio Mike. And so when we downgraded him to work for TOFOP, he became Podcast Mike. And we have just recently, because we have Taylor who does our socials. So we actually have somebody now who she really does handle making sure that we're promoting the episodes, because one of the things we found was we were producing so much content, we weren't really very good at them being up. Yeah, by the time you need to promote something's out, you've already moved on to recording 3 other things. So your head's in a different space. So she's just come on board as part of our team. And then there's Charlie and I, and we have a non-on-air like sort of, business partner, friend of ours, who has a background in radio, and his name is Sam Kavanagh. So that's our team. Like that's our little TOFOP world. And we really do believe in the idea of external to Charlie and I and Sam that everybody else should get paid properly to do their jobs, And so in regard to Wilosophy, we're really looking at the idea of booking episodes, so obviously, the higher quality of the guests, the more work has to go into the idea of convincing somebody to come on the show. The setup of the technology, because one of the things that we really like to do is make sure that they have, at the very least, our preference is that people record into a microphone at their separate ends, and then Mike actually edits the shows together so it seems like we're in the same room. We don't do it with the Zoom or the Zoom lag, for a higher quality of, conversation in your ears. So that obviously takes some time, and just the setting up and the explaining of all that is, probably a bit of that as well, depending on how hooked into this world people are. And then you've really got James Fosdyke, who does original portraits of all the guests. So these incredible portraits that we then use, with quotes from the episodes that, but also I think that are just something, a thank you from us to our guests, for giving us their thoughts and their time and their energy. They, have this incredible James Fosdyke portrait done of them for every episode. And then, I guess the biggest thing of all is that the opportunity cost of my time. So
yeah, of course.
Like it is that thing of, if we are going to do a second episode a week, that is, 2 hours of my week at some stage that I am going to have to, find to not only, Wilosophy is quite a draining show to do. It is, because it is an unplanned conversation, there is a level of active listening and perhaps too much talking, some would suggest, that is involved in doing that. So, and particularly because, sometimes, people can be talking to you about the worst days of their life, or the moment they felt the worst in their life. I have sat across from people in tears, from a specific memory or revelation. There's been people on that show that, I've had disagreements with, that we had, that we've had, past things between us that we needed to reconcile as well. Like, there's often quite in-depth conversations. I recorded one just a couple of days ago, and it happened to be the day after January 26th here, which is Australia Day, or if you believe that, Australia probably shouldn't celebrate the fact that, the English came and stole the country from some people, Invasion Day, Survival Day. I talked to an Aboriginal guy, an Indigenous guy, a fantastic comedian, but I talked to him the day after that day. And that day in Australia is a very tough day for, the First Nations people of Australia. And so this conversation was just, it was an amazing conversation. One of my favourite Wilosophy records I've ever done. But I remember, I'm recording this just downstairs in my office at my house. So realistically, after it's done, you just go back upstairs. I have some lunch with my girlfriend, walk the dogs, do some other work. But I was exhausted for the rest of the day. I really just couldn't, I really got to the point where I was like, I'm just going to mow the lawns, because the idea of trying to think or do some other work or, do the other things that I get, paid to do was hard work. So there is a point where I don't need to make money out of the podcast. I just don't, it needs to be worth my time. There needs to be.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm lucky because, and this has been one of the advantages we've always had, is that this was really more like my hobby. If you asked me what my hobby was, that thing like skiing or something, just something that you put a whole bunch of money in and you don't really ever expect to get much return on your money. You just have a good time while you're doing it. That was podcasting to me. And now obviously things are getting a little bit more serious, both with our shows and just the evolution of the industry. So we've, in the last few years, tried to put a little bit more serious structure around our nonsense, but without losing what's at the heart of the nonsense. We toyed a whole bunch of different times with how do we shape what it is we do to fit in somewhere else. These people have this network, these people have this, world. But that's not what we do. we have our own little world, and we are very happy to have our own little world, but it would just be nice for Charlie and I, and, he has a daughter now, he has a mouth to feed, if our ambition is to turn it into something that really does feel like, at the moment it's financial, but it's like we have now a hobby that makes us a few dollars financial, and everybody gets paid and we get to make our shows. But, we have ambitions that with the evolution of the industry and more people listening to shows, that there might be an opportunity for us to just carve out that it'll still be a little corner of the podcasting world, but it might just be a slightly bigger corner of the podcasting world.
When it's, I don't know where to go with this. I've got two. I've got one about being silly and one about taking over the internet. Pick one.
Ask me about being silly.
It's actually the opposite. When you're speaking to these guys and it gets serious on Wilosophy and you're in tears and you're dealing with serious stuff, when does the comedian turn off?
I would like to think, and this is, oh, sorry. It was going to be a great answer too. Let me know.
Okay, go. You're back.
Oh, yeah, good. I'd like to think that the greatest gift that podcasting has given me is that there is now no differentiation between those two. I think that, that is the major difference between the stand-up world and the podcasting world, is that in the stand-up world, if I am going to talk about something, you tend to have an attitude about it. I like this. I hate this. This is great. This is stupid. Like, you have some sort of definite opinion about something, and compressing those opinions to 1 hour, 80 minutes of stand-up, by the very nature of that, takes out all the grey areas in between. It's very hard to, tell a joke about something if, you're not sure, which way you feel about it yet, or if it's an awkward moment. That's what podcasting is so great at. It gives you the time to. The biggest laughs often come after the most awkward moments. You dig yourself a big enough hole, and then you find gold at the bottom of it. That's part of the appeal, but you don't want to do that on stage. You don't want to have to go through 5 minutes of shit to, you don't want to have to Andy Dufresne it at the end of Shawshank just to get to the, the boat on the beach. I think that there's, so that is the difference. And I think if I'd gone straight from, I guess, doing like Wilosophy from stand-up, then maybe, yes, it would be hard to do. But I think that because this has been I've just got used to having conversations that are sometimes deep and are sometimes funny, and sometimes they can go from being deep to funny. The darkest, some of the funniest lines ever on Wilosophy have come out of somebody trying to cut the tension out of the dark moment they've just revealed. So no, I think they all coexist now. They aren't two different things. They're the exact same thing.
You talk about your hobby media company that's slowly growing a little bit bigger, and Charlie having daughters to feed and so on. I spoke with a guy a couple of weeks ago called Ryan Jesperson from Canada. He was a TV guy, right? Presented a morning show. Broadly, woke up Canada, I think I refer to him as. He was sacked in crazy manner for nothing. And he immediately started an online show doing basically what he did on TV. And now he is the morning but it's online without the network. Do you think that there's a natural progression towards this is what it's going to be over the next 20 years?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that you've just seen people's capacity to listen to things grow exponentially. People understand where the podcast app is. Like, new cars make it very easy for you to plug in your phone or, Bluetooth your phone and, access this sort of information. So the idea of that, having to appeal to everybody, having to, not offend anybody style entertainment just is going to feel very daggy and old fashioned, except in the hands of the people who are incredibly good at it. So I also think it's just about tailoring that experience, that idea that, the night after my team plays in that football match, I know that I can either drive to work the next day listening to a podcast that is like a review podcast of the game, or I can listen to that sports radio station in the hope that in that hour, you know, they discuss the game in between all the other things they're talking about. It just seems nonsensical to me that people don't want to curate their experience in that way. Does it get ruined? I don't know. Like, that's the thing that I always worry about, is that, you know, when all the big companies come to town, does it ruin what is great about it? And I hope that that is never the case. I think probably it won't be, but I do think that there is always something about the arrival of, you know, big business that tends to, we've had our pirate radio moment, and then perhaps everything becomes a little bit more corporatized, and I hope it just doesn't lose the magic while that's happening.
I don't think it can. I think the whole power of it is you said it yourself. There's no, well, where's your figure? Like if a network comes to you and says, look, we love Wilosophy, we love TOFOP, we love it all. We want to take it all off your hands. You know, we'll give you 100 million Aussie dollars over the next 10 years. But we need you just to tweak this bit and change this bit, and, you know, where's the number? Like, the whole point is there shouldn't be one because it's your love.
Yeah, there should not be one. But all I will say is that I'd have to run it by Charlie before I turn down 100 million.
By the way, that wasn't an offer. I don't have it. You might be right in saying, isn't it great to do it for the art? But we'd at least have to call a team meeting if we'd been offered $100 million. Would it die? I mean, as soon as you've got people,
I think so.
It just wouldn't be the same thing, right? You'd lose your actual fan base almost immediately.
Well, the problem is, all it is can you still do? Money isn't a problem, really. Money is only ever a problem when they tell you what you can and can't do. The idea of somebody coming in and giving Dave Chappelle a lot of money to make a TV show is not a bad thing. The problem only arises when they think that money comes with, we can tell you not to say this or to say this.
Well, that was the magnificence of the Rogan Spotify deal, right? That was the genius of it was, or as far as he tells the story, they have no control over anything that comes out of that show.
Yeah, well, that wouldn't surprise me. That's what you're buying. They'd be idiots.
Yeah,
They'd be idiots to change it. Like, why would you buy this thing that is super popular and then, you know, try to make a whole bunch of changes to it? It is one of those things that happens every now and again. So when people just don't quite understand the magic of something, this will probably, I'll have to explain this a little for international listeners, but in Australia, there was these incredible news funny men. So on the end of the news, at the end of the week, they would do this sort of, you know, topical comedy sketch, and they were called Clark and Dorr, and I highly recommend that you watch their stuff. Incredible deadpan comedy. The conceit being that they would play these politicians, but they played them, never dressed up. They never did the voices. It was very much just a two-hander. Brian Dorr interviewing John Clark, who is a New Zealand and Australian comedy genius, and incredible pieces of comedy. Like, they parodied it once because the idea was that one of the commercial networks came and they said, we love what you're doing, but we're going to make it even better. We're going to get you to dress up as the people and do the voices. Because that's network thinking, right? You know what would make this even better? If they looked like them and they sounded like them. No. The thing that makes this incredible is that they don't look like them and they don't sound like them. That's the joke. And you've missed the joke. And I think that if money comes in and supports people to make the sort of stuff they're already making, then there's nothing to be feared with money. But if money comes with, you know, big golden handcuffs, then that's when things become, I don't know. I hope it never ruins what's great about this. I don't think that it will, but I just think that sometimes we're going to have to be strong in saying we want to continue making what it is that we make without restrictions.
I mean, look, you're at home, I'm at home. We're talking to each other across the planet, albeit sorry everyone, through a slightly sketchy Zoom connection. How can anyone change that? If we had big graphics whizzing past us and we had a big extravagant set that needed attending to and changing every season and all of that, then yeah, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars every time you want to make a move. But this could go on, like you said, you and Charlie are going to be doing this forever. This is going to be, you're going to have the in 40 years' time, the bedside episode of Wilosophy with you and Charlie next to each other, just gunning out that last episode, right?
Well, that is very unfair on Charlie, because there is absolutely no way with our various lifestyles that I'm not going to die a good 20 years before Charlie. Charlie will have to get some guest wheels for the final few episodes of TOFOP.
Right. Fair enough. Well, I'm mindful of the fact it's getting on at your end of things. Also, that we're on.
Thank you.
This Zoom connection that I was sort of hoping one day I'd end up in Australia and we can do this in person. Thank you so much for talking to us. I know there's a whole load of people that
that's my pleasure.
Listen to you with we haven't even done the podboard bit. I feel like we'll put that in as a preview at the beginning when I do your introduction. But suffice to say, you fairly dominate with all three podcasts. Across the Podboard 100, and it's been amazing to speak to you. You bring a whole new dimension to the level of experience. There aren't many people that have been podcasting super regularly for 10 years, so I think it's amazing to speak to you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
It's been fun, mate. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to